We are the hosts of this event. I am Susanna Lehvävirta, the director of HELSUS, Helsinki Sustainability Science Institute.
Warm welcome. My name is Toni Ruuska. I'm a university researcher and a docent in sustainable economy. Welcome to this event, coordinated by HELSUS and arranged together by Sitra, Kela, and Club of Rome Finnish Association. So 50 years ago, the Club of Rome commissioned a report, The Limits to Growth. By presenting 12 different scenarios, the report claimed that if the growth in the consumption of natural resources and human population would not be curtailed, contemporary societies would likely face collapses during the 21st century. Unfortunately, the main messages of the report were largely ignored, which has meant the continuation of the destructive and unsustainable economic and societal development. By arranging this event, we want to ask that after 50 years of reporting on ecological overshoot, and as we are facing a deepening ecological crisis, are we finally ready for change? Are we ready to move beyond growth?
I think this is a heavy question, and with this preface, I would like to welcome to the stage Mr. Jorgen Randers.
50 years ago, my friends and I wrote a small book called The Limits to Growth. This book warned about overshoot and collapse at the global level. It presented 12 scenarios for the world from 1970 to the year 2100. 6 of those scenarios were sad scenarios where something went wrong in the 21st century. Either there were too many people or too little resources or too little food or too much pollution. And 6 of the scenarios where humanity managed to organize a certain degree of sustainability in its affairs, so that you didn't get the overshoot and collapse phenomenon. The book did not predict the future. It didn't say what will happen, because that was at the time scientifically impossible with the amount of understanding we had of social systems at the time. So all we could do at the time was to advise the world against the sad scenarios, the overshoot and collapse scenarios, and then say, why don't you try to pursue sustainability? We didn't call it sustainability at the time. We called it equilibrium or no growth, things like this. But sustainability came 20 years later as the label. What did we recommend? We simply said, mankind, please remember that you're living on a finite globe. So please organize your lives so that you do not conflict with this totally obvious fact that we cannot have an endless number of people and we cannot have endless amount of physical resource use per person. So, what has happened since? The short answer is, as Tony said, the world has essentially followed its normal path, namely the average of all of those scenarios we made 12 years ago. And recently there is a lady who has done science on this. So she has taken the 4 most important scenarios in the 1972 book and compared it with what has actually happened. So the colored ones are 4 of the scenarios. There are 2 sad scenarios and 2 positive scenarios. And the black dot, this is for the population development towards 2100. The black dots shows what has actually happened. And you can see on this graph that the world population has essentially followed what we stated 50 years ago. You can do the same thing with industrial output, which is the closest we get in the model to the real GDP. And again, you see that the world has followed essentially the average of those 4 scenarios. You can do the same thing with slightly more exotic concepts, namely well-being. So that this is the Human Development Index, if some of you know this. And you see the very interesting fact that yes, well-being, average global well-being has been going up during the last 30 to 40 years. But you are seeing a leveling off of the well-being development. The black line is starting to flatten out, just like in the limits to growth main scenarios. So in summary, yes, the world hasn't reacted very strongly to the limits to growth message. At least the first 50 years is tracking essentially the main core of the scenarios. The second conclusion you can draw is that we have grown into overshoot. So we are now at a level, particularly in climate, which is way beyond the sustainable level, namely what can be absorbed in the same year as it is being emitted. Let me take that a little more in detail, because what you can conclude from what we have seen over the last 50 years is that we have not run into resource limits. We have not run out of coal, we have not run out of oil, we have not run out of gas. And we have not run out of agricultural land. Many of the limits in the limits to growth has not been exceeded to the extent that this is a global affair. The only area where we really have overshot is in the area of climate. We are every year now emitting twice as much CO2 into the atmosphere as is being absorbed in the oceans and the forests of the world during that year. So this remaining half, sits in the atmosphere, and as the years go by, more and more and more of this thing is accumulating in the atmosphere. The concentration of CO2 rises, and the temperature, gets higher and higher, and will continue to do so. Not only until we stop emitting CO2, but we have to suck out, the CO2 that is already added. The third conclusion from looking at the last 50 years is that we have had no overshoot. We have had no collapse. So the curves are going up, but we haven't seen yet, a rapid decline in the population or a rapid decline in anything else. And fourthly, we have seen some positive developments during these last 50 years. For instance, the number of children per woman in the world has declined on average from 3.5 to 2.5. And as a consequence, the population bomb has been stopped. The world population will peak around 9 billion people in another 30 years. And so the population problem has been solved. Also in the area of energy efficiency has increased tremendously during the last 50 years. And you have also positive developments in popular attitudes. More people at this point in time are interested in green issues than 50 years ago. And perhaps as important, institutional development. We now have people like Maria, who are actually ministers of issues that did not exist 50 years ago. So at least there is some positive developments. But what is, in sum, the current situation? Well, the current situation is that in the rich world, the most serious problem is climate. And if you look at most of the world, namely the 6 billion people that do not live among us, poverty remains the problem. So we have two problems at this point in time: climate and poverty, global poverty. This graph is interesting because it shows the annual emissions of CO2. And you may notice, or you will not notice, that we have now spoken about stopping the growth in annual emissions for 30 years. The IPCC was established in 1988. And one should have assumed that since its sole purpose is to get this curve to level off and go down, one should have been able, after 30 years, to see some indication that this is not continuing growth. It is still going up. as we are speaking and as we're running the umpteenth COP. So there is a lot of talk and absolutely no visible effect on global emissions at this point in time. Yes, European emissions are going down slightly, but of course compensated for by increased emissions in China, who has taken over the production that we're just outsourcing. So this is really, it doesn't work. The next question then is, so we have overshot, we have not yet seen collapse. We see that the climate sector is where the limits to growth thesis is being tested most clearly. So you can ask the question, what is going to happen during the next 50 years? What we did 3 years ago when we started planning for the 50-year anniversary book, which is called Earth4All, is essentially to say that we are observing that human well-being is leveling off. We fear that it is going to continue down. So we decided to make a study of human well-being during the next 50 years. And so we did, and as Tony again said, 2 weeks ago, we published the German version of this report. It is already in the 4th printing. They have printed 30,000 copies in 2 weeks. So luckily, it seems that we managed to get through, and I'll tell you later why we got through, how we got through. And the American one came yesterday, I think, 20th of September. That's perhaps 2 days ago. And so we are in the early stage of trying to send our new message to the world. This study of well-being is deliberately the head label instead of GDP growth. We're aiming for a society that tries to grow well-being. And in order to do this in a proper manner, here is the definition of well-being that we have ended up using. So we're looking at well-being as consisting of 5 components. The first component is the disposable income after tax. The second one is the amount of public services available. The third one is the level of inequality in society. And the fourth one is observed damage. It's the observed global warming. And the fifth one, is what we call perceived progress, capturing the fact that if you have a society where well-being is going up, the mood and the political support to strong governments is much better than if you have a society where well-being is going down, where people start to worry about the future and start to do all the negative things that happens when there is no perceived progress. So this is our composite indicator, which we use as the performance indicator in our study. Most other people who build formal models use GDP as the goal, because they say that total production of goods and services, if it goes up, it's good. If it goes down, it's bad. We say that that is not true. It is the well-being of people that matters, not the GDP. We have built an impressive model, which certainly is not visible on this screen, and there is no need for you. This is just to brag. This is just to show that this is an enormous amount of work, enormous amount of data. The only thing it does, it makes us sure that we present consistent scenarios, pictures where we do think about the effect if you tax the rich, the fact that they then have less money to invest. We take this into account, so that you don't dream like most sustainability researchers do, in some way or the other. Fine. What happens? So this is the future in the situation where there is no extraordinary action. So as our base run, we look at what do we think are the consequences over the next 50 years if decision-making is done in the same style as during the last 40 years? So this is not, so in the system, decisions concerning family size are endogenous in the sense that they choose to have the number of children which the conditions in the model system says or indicates, at future. The societal reaction to pollution is dependent on the level of the pollution in the system at the future point in time. So nothing is locked up. This is, a model, endogenous, fully endogenous, except for some technological advance, that calculates its way into the future. And so we believe that these are much less unreliable models than most models, which are either business as usual models or assuming a certain policy change. So what happens in this run? You look at the top, the thing goes from 1980 to 2100. The red line is the global population, which passes the 6 billion mark in the year 2000, passes the 7.8 billion, that is the current 2020 population, and then it peaks around 2050. Why does it peak? It peaks because women in the model system have gotten sufficiently affluent that they choose to have fewer children rather than go into job instead. Life expectancy is, of course, going up all the time, reducing the number of deaths, but still the balance comes out so that we get a peak in the population around 9 billion people in 2050. If you look at the blue line is the GDP per person. This is the indicator that all economists are interested. In our view, the GDP growth is going to continue through the century, relatively unaffected and more or less at the same growth rate as observed in the past. The structural composition, for those of you who are economists, will shift. We will shift from a dirty fossil-based economy towards a green, renewable-based economy aiming for well-being instead of aiming for rapidly increasing GDP. If you look at the sad things, you can see there is a solid line going up. This is the average temperature. So this is the global warming, and you see it starts from a low value in 1980, it passes through the +1 degree centigrade in 2020, and it levels off around 2.5 degrees centigrade at the end of the century. So our business as usual forecast is that we will actually blast through the +1.5 degrees, we will blast through the 2 degrees, and we will then finally stop this madhouse at the end of the century at +2.5 degrees centigrade. You can also see another gray line, which is inequality. This is the income of the richest 10% after tax divided by the income of the 90% poorest after tax. And you see that this inequality is increasing throughout the run because this is an inherent characteristic of capitalist societies of the type that dominate the world, where wealth tends to concentrate on fewer and fewer hands as long as you maintain competition and all the things that is the dream of democratic market economies. The sum is the green line, which is the well-being index, and you see it has been increasing over the last 20, 30 years with the big business cycle swings, and then it starts a decline, towards the middle of this century, 2060, and then it stays low throughout. And there is no mystery in this, So the income is going up, the social services are going up, but the climate is getting warmer and inequality is getting worse and worse. And so the sum total of this is a well-being that declines. And as it declines, the hope for the future declines. And so it further declines. And then what happens in the model system is local social collapse. You don't get collapse because of environmental reasons and not at the global level, but you do get national breakdown, basically, when people really get pissed off. And so this is the future. We call it too little, too late. All the young researchers in the project say that we are easily going to pass the political decisions necessary in order to solve this problem. I am 77 and a depressed man, so I say this is not going to be easy, but we should still try. So let's see what it takes, to make well-being in the model system not go down, but perhaps increase a little bit further in this century. For those of you who see in front of you a technocrat whom you do not trust, I've put in a small paragraph for you because you, at this point in time, would like to say, Mr. Randers, and you should please entitle me Dr. Randers, not like this lady who calls me Mr. Randers. I'm the most highly educated person on the surface of the earth. So Dr. Randers, is it possible to make a mathematical model that says something of importance or significance about the next 50 years? And my answer is, contrary to most model builders in the world and contrary to most economists of the world, a resounding yes. It is possible to say more than nothing. What you can say something about are trends. It is not possible to predict events at particular things in the future, but you can say something about trends. Why? The reason is that if you start looking at data in a proper manner, you can find stable relationships between human behavior and the income level. The one which is behind the clouds here shows the GDP per person along the horizontal axis and the energy use in physical units, million tons of oil equivalent per person per year. And all the thin lines are the various regions of the world over the last 40 years. And although the precision is not very high, you see that when you start as poor, you use little energy, and then as you get richer, you use more and more energy. But for those of you who doubt the Kuznets curve, notice in the United States of America, one of the richest economies, the per capita consumption of energy has been stable for the last 40 years. And in my country, which is the stinking richest country on the surface of the earth, we produce more hydropower and more oil and gas than is ethical, decent, etc., etc. In our households, the electricity use per family has been going down for the last 20 years. Why? Because we introduce heat pumps, which are efficient, so the important point is that energy use per person does actually stabilize when you get into the $30,000 per person per year, approximately the level of Finland. You are at the starting point of this flat plateau, if my memory is correct about your GDP. Calculated in 2017, our purchasing power parity, dollars. And since none of you know what is the unit, none of you can give me the number offhand, but if someone could, I guess it must be 30,000. Norway is 60,000, US is 50,000, Europe on average is 40,000. I presume you are at the European average or perhaps a little bit below, meaning that you're getting close now to the point where energy use per person no longer increases, if measured not in dollars, but in physical units. I've tried to convince you that this is the too little, too late scenario. And you can start, and I've said that the basis for making forecasts like this is simply heroic assumptions put into a system, and then you try to see what is a consistent future. What should be done? So I'm telling you that if we don't do anything particular, well-being is actually going to decline on average in the world over the next 50 years. So what should be done? And that's, of course, the main topic of the new book, the Earth for All book. What was it called? I am not in the marketing team. So they call it a survival guide for humanity. That's fancy. In my mind, what we're doing, we have discussed back and forth what are the 5 most important actions that humanity should put in place if they want well-being, to not go down, ideally level off or go a little bit up. And these we call turnarounds, just to have a label that people might remember. So we are discussing and arguing in favor of 5 extraordinary actions for humanity. And the first one is poverty, the poverty turnaround. This is to make sure that all poor nations on the surface of the earth actually reaches a GDP of $15,000 per person per year. India is at 4, Africa south of Sahara is at 2. So there is a huge job of good old-fashioned economic development that needs to take place in the poor end of the spectrum. Maximum old-fashioned growth, and growth in material consumption and growth in everything else in order to remove undignified poverty that has existed, for a much, much too many years. And mind you, the rich population is 2 billion. The poor population, the one that are below 15,000, is 6 billion. So for three quarters of the world population, the climate issue is much less important than poverty. And that's the reason why the poverty turnaround is at the top. How does one achieve rapid economic growth in the third world? The only thing we say publicly, and then I'll say afterwards what I say privately, in order to... So publicly we say that we cannot continue to use the development methods that we have been pushing for the last 50 years, because they don't work. What have we tried to push onto the third world over the last 40 years? It's, of course, the Washington Consensus, the World Bank type of solution, public austerity, free competition, illegal to support infant industries, all those things that makes it absolutely certain that a poor country cannot development has been the textbook. So the point is that we have to throw out the Washington Consensus, and that means throwing out the market solution, and that means supporting strong government. All of these things is, of course, to banne I kjerka. So we say in Norwegian, what does this in English? I don't know. And so it is heresy, what we are presenting under point number 1. Personally, since I have been working for the Chinese over the last 10 years, the Chinese have doubled the GDP per person for 1.3 billion people in the last 40 years. So at least there exist on the surface of the earth techniques that is capable of doing what needs to be done for the 6 billion remaining poor people. Yes, I know, at once when I say I like China, people stop listening because they think Uyghurs, Hong Kong, Spratly Islands. And it's impossible to get a meaningful discussion. And so my colleagues never mention China in this context. They say, look to Costa Rica, which is another way. And I would say, look to Sweden and Norway, particularly from 1945 to 1965, a period where 200 gentlemen in Oslo made all the decisions on behalf of the people and built the welfare state of Norway in those 20 years before the right-wing parties took over in 1965. And slowed down the real move towards a collective and egalitarian society. The second one is the inequality thing. That's very simple. It's take from the rich and give to the poor. So this is just transfer legislation that mandates. Empowerment is the third one, which is also very simple. We know from the past 50 years that if you make available to everyone education, health, contraception, and opportunity, then the women very, very quickly rise to decent positions and choose to have a job rather than having children at home. So the empowerment one is very important, both because of human rights issues and egalitarian and fairness issues, but also because it really solves the underlying problem of population growth. Food, we survive well. We produce in the world more than enough food to feed everyone a decent diet, even at the current level. The problem is that this way of running agriculture destroys biodiversity in the process. So we need, and it also leads to 15% of the climate problem. So we need just to change agricultural and forestry procedures so that they get more climate friendly. And the fifth thing we have already spoken about, that's the energy sector. There is only one thing we need to do, and that is to phase out the use of coal, oil, and gas and replace with renewable energy and energy efficiency and carbon capture and storage. So the final thing I add, because when you do the calculations, you can see that it is not enough only to move the world to wind and sun and introduce maximum electrification. You actually need to capture some of the carbon that comes from the industrial use of heat in order to make the world come at plus 2.5 degrees centigrade at the end of the century. If you don't use the CCS, you end up at 3. So this is what is called net negative emissions in the lingo. So these are the 5 TAs. What do they cost? Because since it's so obvious what needs to be done, why has it not happened? Of course, it hasn't happened because this is slightly more expensive than doing nothing. And it also has the side effect that you lose jobs in the dirty sector before you get the green jobs. And so people fear this thing because that it threatens their income. The cost of doing this, we estimate, along with others who have tried to estimate this, at between 2 and 4% of global income. And what it amounts to is essentially to taking 2 to 4% of the labor and the real capital of the world, shifting it from dirty production to green production. So in clear talk, it means to take the Wärtsilä yard workers, easier to talk about Norwegian yard workers who are currently producing oil platforms and diesel ships, and just ask them to produce floating platforms with windmills. The same equipment and the same talent. And this is what the shift from a dirty economy, fossil-driven, GDP-oriented thing to a sustainable one amounts to on the ground. It's simply a shift of workforce from dirty activity, unsustainable activity, to sustainable activity. And the amount is surprisingly small. It's a few % of the total income, which means that it is not difficult to ask the rich to pay, because the 10% richest in the world control 50% of global income. So if you want them to pay 2 to 4%, it means that you need to add to their income tax roughly 5 percentage points. And that's what it takes. So tax the rich, give the money to the government, who then pays people to create a sustainable future for the majority. Am I elected? And the reason is, of course, the fact that most people hate taxes, and they hate the state, and they hate regulations, and consequently, there is no way a democracy is capable of making the necessary decisions. I still have 3 minutes left. Unreal. I thought I was far beyond the deadline already. Then I'll take the 2 last points. So what is this? What does it amount to? So what do we need to do? Well, first of all, this amounts to a transformation of modern economies from economies that use fossil energy in order to increase the GDP, the value of annual production of goods and services, as fast as possible, to an economy which uses labor and capital to increase the well-being of the masses instead. So it's a transformation. It's not, you don't need to throw out the system. You just need to, as I said, shift. There's a structural shift from dirty to clean activity. The problem is that this is not profitable from the business point of view. So shifting the worker from doing the dirty job where there is a high labor productivity, high income per man year, into one of the green things where the income is much lower. If it had been higher, then the capitalists of the world very quickly would have invested in these things. They don't. And we know from 40 years that they're pretending that they're doing this, and the banks are now greenwashing themselves, and everyone is doing all the... Luckily, I've been the chairman of 3 banks in my life, so I know this, and I have sat on the Sustainability Council of 3 horrible multinationals for 15 years. Dow Chemical in the United States, British Telecom in London, and AstraZeneca, which is somewhat closer to home. And just to see, what one is doing on the inside is very helpful. Then at least you understand what's going on and can call a spade if you don't get your salary from them. Which is an important point on many scores. So we need to shift investments from dirty activity, coal, oil and gas, into other things. But it is not profitable to do so, so the market will never put sufficient income. So how do you do it instead? You take the money from the rich, and then you invest it. The government invests it in non-profitable activity, which helps the world, instead of having them invest it in things that makes the problem bigger. It is collective action that is necessary, in my mind. Voluntary individual action does not suffice. The free market will not do this. What is the fundamental challenge at this point in time for sustainability workers and for everyone else? Well, it is to establish political support, public support, democratic support for higher taxes and more regulation. This is what is needed in order to solve the sustainability problem. And as I've said before, if there is one thing that people hate, it is higher taxes and more regulation. So in a democratic society, it is not possible to get this to happen. And consequently, one becomes a pessimist like me, with a smiling face in order to entertain you. The next question then, if the challenge really is to, get political support for something which is not liked, is there any way in which you could do this? And the answer is luckily yes. If you make sure that the people don't get a bill, then it is more likely that they would be in favor of this shift. And if you also compensated those people that lose their job while they are finding a green job, you pay their full salary, the state pays the full salary, then it is conceivable that you could do something. So then comes the question, is there any way in which the state could finance the system, the shift, the transformation, in such a way that they do not send a tax bill to the voter? Because then you might have a winning platform. You could get a lot of votes for this type of platform. So then you must ask the question, how can governments finance sustainability action? How can they finance the 5 turnarounds? And there are 3 ways. There is more taxes, borrowing, or printing money. Higher taxes is impossible if you want to have a democratic majority, but that's where we end up saying, if you tax the 10% richest only, and we know that they can afford it, then you should get a democratic majority to support this thing. Of course, in the United States of America, which I love. I've lived in the United States and got my education there, but I love the America that existed in 1970, not the America that exists now. In the United States of America, there is no way you will ever get support for a strong government, a majority support. So the United States, in our book and in my mind, is lost. They are on the peak. They were on the peak 10 years ago, and they're now gradually going to decline while China rises as the superpower of the world. The second way of doing this is borrowing. Who do you then borrow from? And that's where it is very important to always, in your mind, split the population in two groups. It's the owners and the workers, the rich and the poor. What is a worker? A worker is a person who spends most of his income every year. So there's only a tiny little difference. So when you borrow from someone, who do you borrow from? Of course, from the rich. So borrowing is the same as getting some money from the rich and pay the person interest rates back. And where do you get the interest rate? From the poor. So solving this through borrowing, like the COVID thing did, is yet another way of increasing inequality in society. So number two, borrowing is not a good idea, in addition to the fact that this is postponing the bill to future generations. This is just like your nuclear plant, where you dig down the residue and assume that 10,000 years from now, they will be happily still watching your repository. This is not criticism of the repository. It's the only way to handle it. But this, in principle, is, of course, shifting the bill to future generations. And then comes the final way of doing this, and that's to print money. So, of course, one could instruct the central bank to print an additional 2% of the national income, earmark the money for green activity so that it is being used to pay directly on the ground the guy who's building the windmill, or the girl who is making the solar panel, or the whatever who is tending to the old, in a non-profitable situation. This I am not allowed to say, because people get so angry when you speak about China that if you also talk about the fact that it's very easy for a country that has its own currency, so Finland is out, but for a country that has its own currency to just print exactly the amount of money that is necessary in order to solve whatever problem they want. Of course, modern industrial societies have legislation in the book that ensures that central banks don't do this. So it requires tremendous legislation change to change the goal of the central bank. And we know that this is going to take 30 years, to get this to happen. And so we're back to the simple solution, and then I'll read it loud, and that is the end. The world has a problem. The prospect of declining well-being in the decades ahead, caused by global warming and rising inequality. The problem can be solved, but it will require 5 extraordinary turnarounds paid for by the 10% richest in order to be politically feasible. And finally, what should you do? You should reduce your ecological footprint and support an active and well-funded state. Or somewhat more briefly, so you can put it up on a banner, electrify and vote for a red-green party.